All right. All right, everyone. I hope you're doing well. So this is our last class in terms of new material. Monday we'll have our synthesis day, but then you made it through Bio 107, so yay. And to answer your question, that was 99 Red Balloons, and that was the cover by Goldfinger. Yeah, it's a great cover. Let's see. All right, so yeah, so again, so you have the recapture and your grades is open for quiz 5. So I have office hours on Tuesday or other times if you want to talk about the quiz. There will be recapture for quiz 6. It'll be due during finals week. So it'll actually be due after your final. But I think that's it. Do we have any questions or concerns before I start this this lecture?
Prof. Diaz, I'm just going to jump in again to give my reminder about CEQs. We will take a little class time on Monday to complete them. That said, if we are at near 100% sort of completion rate on Monday, we don't have to take that time, and we can spend more time on our synthesis day. So I really encourage everybody to take a moment, 5-10 minutes of your day, fill that out, and we're currently like at somewhere between 20 and 30% of the class having filled it out. So please take that time, and then we can spend more time answering questions, getting ready for the quiz, getting ready for exam 2 on Monday. Okay.
Yeah. So so if you go onto Moodle, I posted a link of the CEQs, so you can go directly to it via that. It should be at the end with all of the stuff we're currently doing this week. Quiz 6 is going to be on Wednesday. So yeah, I was giving you Wednesday because Tuesday it allows people to come in for office hours on Tuesday to kind of ask questions before the last quiz. Yeah, it is unfortunate that your your final and your quiz are very close to each other, but this condensed semester. The recapture for quiz 5 is due next week. As long as you get it in, it's fine. There's no specific date. If you think it's going to be past next week, email me, but that's when it's supposed to be due. I just know there's a lot of deadlines that are all coming up right now at the same time. So even, just for this class. Yeah. All right. Let's jump into conservation biology and global change. Woo. All right. Yeah, sure. Email me, Emma. And if you really need to take the quiz early, you can take it before, you can take it on Tuesday or after class on Monday if you really like, if you really need to. Cool. So today we're going to be talking about, we've been discussing biodiversity, talking about, the variety of life in an ecosystem, how they interact, right? So today we're just going to talk about conservation biology, what scientists are trying to do in order to keep biodiversity high in ecosystems and in our general lives. In areas surrounding us, we've terraformed and changed, right, a lot of our landscape. We've removed a lot of, predators and things such as, wolves and things from the environment. So there's already a very unnatural, breakdown of our environments. And so what we'll talk about is the idea of losing species causes an even further loss of biodiversity, generally speaking. But I also wanted to, before we go into that, touch on kind of the different types of biodiversity biodiversity and conservation efforts that we're doing at Vassar. And so, the professor says that like biodiversity, ecology can be evaluated on many levels, just a little reminder. And so, we're looking at genetic diversity in terms of, within a species, because having only, a certain set of genomes makes it more likely that a system can collapse, right? Things like that. Obviously, the one we talk about the most is the idea of species diversity, right? About how many different species, genre, orders, and different ecological niches can exist in an environment. And I did hear about this removal of getting rid of all the wolves. I wasn't sure where it was. It's very interesting idea. It's going to cause the need for a lot of like hunting for like deer and other small game, which maybe they are fine with and/or is the purpose. But I know other places like Yellowstone, they just reincorporated wolves, right? They're trying to bring back that natural balance. And then, because really we're not only are concerned about like different species in an environment, right? We're concerned about the community diversity and these interactions between species, right? We need predators to keep prey in check. We need those prey to not overpopulate and overeat, the primary producers and stuff like that, right? There needs to be this cycling in order for communities to survive. But in order to properly create, these different types of community diversities, we need to have ecosystem diversity, right? We need to have a lot of, different biotic and abiotic environments, different layouts of nutrition and things of that in order to create different niches for organisms, right? So if we have no diversity in an ecosystem, that will lower the community diversity, which will ultimately lower the species diversity. And then theoretically, as populations get smaller, you get this genetic diversity that also starts to go away when there's not enough, interaction. And so, right, as just a quick step up of like how this works, right? We have genetic diversity in these different voles, for instance, and then we have the way that they're interacting with the coastal ecosystems, and then how those ecosystems have these different, biogeochemical cycles, right? And all these organisms are playing important roles in that cycle. And so conservation and restoration ecology, conservation is primarily talking about the management of biodiversity and natural resources. So going into an environment, seeing the state of things and trying to keep it in that natural state, right? Trying to keep it from, being destroyed by natural disasters or human intervention. We're trying to keep what we have there. Restoration ecology, however, is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded or destroyed. And so on Vassar, at the preserve, we actually do both of these. We do a lot of restoration ecology, in which we're trying to restore, replant trees, remove invasive species and things like that from the environment. And so, benefits of species diversity, like why do we care? There's potential for good medicine, food, and fibers, right, in an environment. Natural selection is going to create a lot of amazing chemicals that we aren't naturally going to produce in our bodies that we may be able to utilize. And so, for instance, antibiotics, the first ones that were ever created were all created for, were natural chemicals that are produced by fungi and bacteria, right? They are natural defense mechanisms that we are co-opting and using to say, get rid of syphilis and other such diseases. So we never know what could be out there, especially with the massive amount of biodiversity and ecological niches there are. And then also, we are generally interested in biodiversity because ecosystems that have a lot of, broken food web connections or don't have a lot of species in them are a lot more likely to lead to extinction. Just in terms of having organisms that are adaptable to an environment, right? The less diversity there is, the less likely it is that some organism in that population can withstand changes in pH temperatures, in pH or temperatures of the region or water concentration. And so in order to protect our own natural environments, we need to keep them biodiverse in that way. And so just a little bit about the Vassar Preserve and Farm. Its mission is to protect and preserve ecological diversity of the land and to ensure educational value. So if you're interested in field ecology, if you're interested in learning anything about that, I would suggest reaching out to some of the ecologist professors in the department. And you should be able to, and I'm sure a lot of them have opportunities in order to do research. So on the preserve, we do a lot of things such as surveying lands, planting trees. There's even periods where they bring in goats in order to try to curb and eat some of the invasive species that are on there. But there's a lot of work being done on both understanding how biodiversity changes in different areas and also conserving the natural beauty and biodiversity that we have. And so the preserve originally was, a farm, a working farm that would donate food to the college. It was also, originally in 1895, was purchased to create, filler beds to treat Vassar sewage. In Bio 108, you will take, a nice little tour of the preserve, and they'll give you a lot more information about that in terms of what it was used for and these different transitions, and how Vassar's relationship with both the city of Poughkeepsie and with nature has evolved over time. And as Vassar's become more and more ecologically and conservationally concerned, we've made a lot of changes to how we treat the land and also things of that nature. So in in the early 1900s, there were other small, farms and properties that were utilized. But between then and the 50s, it became a full working dairy farm. Students from Vassar would work, with cows, would work farming the land. But after a while, it became a little too, as the school got too big, it became a little too unsustainable. It became not economically viable. So it closed in the 1950s. And so in the 60s, they started to think about what we could actually use the land for. In the 60s, is when we started a little bit more of our concern about, nature around us, being a little bit more cognizant of how we treat the land. And so that's when it was proposed that it would become an ecological preserve. And so it's a mixed use plan was adopted. And so the preserve is established, and by a mixed use plan, we mean that this is going to be utilized for many different reasons in terms of scientists using their land, but also making it a point in order to try to have many different types of ecosystems on the same land, trying to maintain that diversity of ecosystem so that we could, use those different pieces of land in order to, not only teach, but understand conservation. And so if you look on the left in 1936, this is a patchwork of farms. You can see all of these different kind of plots. But, by 2004, you can see that there's a large change in in what organisms are on this, right? You can immediately just see that there are all of these trees and then these different types of plots that are located across it. And so Vassar actively tries to maintain diversity in ecosystems. And so, on Vassar campus, we seem to have over 500 species of plants, 144 species of birds. We have cameras out on the preserve that are used to, look at mammals and look at both air quality, water quality, things of that nature. And so, you can see videos. We have little skunks and bobcats and cute little, smaller predators. But one thing that, Vassar provides is, there's a field station, there's a weather station. So we're able to look at, the different conditions that are happening over the year and how they may be affecting different parts of growth of different organisms. Lots of trails. So if you haven't been out there, I'm sure, with being locked up, you hopefully all have taken a walk out there, but there's lots of marked trails. And then obviously there is research space, at the information kiosks, as well as people who are actively working, trying to teach both conservation and things of that nature. But Vassar, you remember we talked about this idea of ecological succession, right? Vassar makes it a point on the preserve to mow different areas, different rates. In certain cases, they will actually change their method of disturbance. And so Vassar is doing this for a few reasons. One, we want to see, what kind of species diversity we can create by also having diversity in ecosystems. But we also want to know, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, but we also want to know about how different types of disturbance behaviors affect that biodiversity. So in certain parts of the preserve, we mow it every year, and so it stays constant at this kind of pioneer species level, this old field level, or even this early succession plots. We then can have areas that we only mow every 3 or 4 years, which allow it to build up into these, these early succession and mid-successional communities over time with smaller shrubs that invade. And then obviously the preserve is a forested area. So we have kind of these other communities of different types of trees in terms of their diversity. But we do a fun thing where like certain places don't get mowed. They actually bring in like goats, and the goats come in and eat all of the saplings and all of these other types of things. And so they can, kind of cull down these successional things. But, we're interested in how they build up and how we can change and affect these different types of diversity. We're doing a lot of tree planting on the preserve, a lot of terraforming and stuff in that nature. And so, biodiversity, there are a lot of things that can negatively affect it, right? So habitat loss is something that's constant, the destruction of trees, the destruction of, home space. And, if you remove different types of trees, you're going to remove ecological niches, right? Those organisms that lived in the trees can no longer do that. They're not going to be on the ground competing with organisms that are already naturally there. So just by habitat loss, you're going to lose species to competition in that way. And then in kind of in that same vein is the idea of overharvesting. But overharvesting also not only has to do with habitat loss in terms of like taking down trees, but overharvesting water, overharvesting, using land too much to grow food and wind up taking out all the nutrients in there, right? One thing that's really important that you may or may not think about is, we grow a lot of food and we have more sustainable agricultural practices nowadays. But one thing you may not think about is the fact that, so we grow corn, for instance, right? And then we take that corn and we transfer it somewhere else. So in a natural system, that corn would be digested, broken down, and returned to the soil about where it is. And so you would have nutrients being replenished in that cycle, right? You would have a positive feedback loop of giving, building up more plant matter through sun and then having them die and then return decomposition, things like that. But by transferring food from areas, we're actually we're lowering the amount of energy and biological matter that is innately returned to the land there. And so that's something that we need to think about in terms of making sure agricultural practices are sustainable. Are we taking proper precautions to return that material to the soil? Things like that. And then obviously natural disturbances, any destruction of an environment can lead to large drops in biodiversity for the same reason as habitat loss. And then again, invasive species, that's one of the biggest problems on the farm for us, is the fact that there are, dozens of plant invasive species that are reproducing through their roots or producing, thousands of seeds every season. And they're just out competing the natural native species that are on the preserve. And so that's another thing they try to look at is how can you, how can you deal with these invasive species without destroying the natural native plants, right? Especially if they're more susceptible. And then obviously something I'll talk about a little bit more is the idea of climate change and how that affects, species distribution and stuff like that. But ultimately, a lot of them are humans. We cause a lot of innate threats to biodiversity just in our lifestyles, right? We're overharvesting, we're doing habitat loss, we're making climate change worse, we're introducing invasive species to areas. And so that's the reason why we're trying to counteract that type of thing, right? Um, but environments and organisms can go through extinction, right? And that's what we're trying to stop. We're trying to stop widespread extinction. And so your textbook has this idea of what's called an extinction vortex. It's how a species goes from being, doing very well in an environment to ultimately leading to the extinction or the removal of the species. And so a big problem with this is often just the small population of a group, right? If not enough of them are surviving, passing on their genes, there's going to be less and less. And so having an innate small population can cause extinction to occur faster because of a lot of different things, right? So you have inbreeding and genetic drift and stuff like that. That's going to be losing genetic variation, which again, without that genetic variation means that as a population, those organisms are more likely to have lower fitness or the ability to adapt, right? If you don't have a lot of genetic variation, the chances that your organism is going to learn to, live on the forest floor as opposed to the canopy is going to be much less. Obviously, there's only so much change that can occur in generations and things of that nature. So sometimes, environments are changing way too quickly or too dramatically for many populations to survive. And so you have a small population that has genetic loss, which leads to less fitness, which then creates, lower reproduction, higher mortality, which creates a smaller population. And so this cycle will just continue over and over again until that species goes extinct. And we have this idea of a minimal viable population, or the number of individuals that can sustain a population, right? Our selected species, they're producing lots and lots of eggs. But if those eggs aren't surviving at a high rate, you're going to need even more parents to produce more eggs, even if just because there's a lot of, of offspring being produced doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have, high reproduction. They might have high mortality anyway. And so this becomes very iffy, and it'll vary depending on species, methods of reproduction, as well as their environments. But, scientists try to figure this out, and, often it's very difficult because you can't control what mates, you can't control what finds each other in the wild. There's a big problem with wild tigers, right? They don't come into contact with each other. There's so few of them in the environment that their population is still decreasing, right? They're still individuals, but it's not really being sustained. And so, as I said, spiders lay hundreds of eggs. It's easier to populate an area. But, elephants gestate for 18 months, right? So it takes longer to repopulate. And so they're more likely to get hit with this extinction vortex, right? Because they're not going to be able to change or acclimate as quickly. They're also going to have lower reproduction overall. Even if they do survive, four elephants becoming 6 elephants, then quickly dying and becoming 4 again is not going to be sustainable, as opposed to a spider, which is, 1 to 1,000 to 300 to hopefully 20,000 or something like that. Unless you don't like spiders, in which case it's 0. Yeah. Let's see. And so how are humans affecting the planet? How are these different types of issues occurring? So, we have contamination, right? So we have the idea of excess nutrient enrichment. I discussed this a little bit, right, when we were talking about algae blooms and talking about how, we have to return nutrients to the soil, right? Because we're moving food from place to place. So we need to use fertilizers. but all of that nitrogen is not going to be utilized, by creatures, right? It's going to wash out into rivers and streams, and it's going to be accessible to other organisms in case of, those protists, right, that are going to be photosynthetic, and you're going to create these algae blooms, right? We then have pharmaceuticals, which is something you may not think about, but every drug that gets dumped down a sink is going to be washed out into the water. And so, due to oversupplying of pharmaceuticals and also dumping of it, there are active amounts of estrogen and atrazine and other chemicals in the environment that do actively affect organisms, right? And then, you may not even think about it, but there's plastic waste, right? There's all of the plastic that's unbiodegradable. This is a picture of one of those plastic islands in the middle of the ocean where everything kind of just clings together. And so we're contaminating in this very physical sense, right? And I'll go over microplastics in a second. But yeah, as I said, nutrient enrichment, we transport fruit great distances, and we're eating nutrients from another area, right? Where our ecosystems are very greatly created by our ability to transport things as well as food, right? And so over farming can destroy areas and remove their viability. If you learned about the Dust Bowl before we had better agricultural practices, we essentially farmed the Midwest out until its soil became, sand and dust and didn't have enough nutrients to supply plants. And so everything started to die. But then, we also have the opposite issue, right? We have to keep, it's like the great Shakespearean, hero thing, like nothing in excess. We have to figure out viable levels for everything. But yeah, runoff from fertilizer transfers nutrients into new regions, which may or may not be bad, depending on how water flows and things of that nature. But pharmaceuticals get flushed in the water systems, and they change organisms in the environment, right? Think of biomagnification. You have birth defects, you have issues with reproductive parts. So for instance, atrazine in the water is creating multi-gender frogs. So frogs that, both produce sperm and have eggs in them, but don't have the appropriate, materials in order to self-fertilize or do anything of that nature, right? And so these chemicals, have a buildup, and they also will affect us, right? Ultimately, if we poison our waters with too much pesticides, right, those fish are going to negatively affect us. But then plastic wastes, I actually have a old colleague who works in plastics, and he said that currently only about 4% of the plastic in the world is biodegradable, and on any reasonable time scale. And so that just blew my mind, because I know we've been talking about it for a long time, right? Trying to stop these plastics that decompose over the course of 1,000 years as opposed to 10 or 100. But it's such a small percentage of the world, and that we've made that type of transition. And so we just have issues where we have plastic building up in the environment, both in large quantities and in micro quantities, right? So we have microplastics, which are just little beads of plastic, little microscopic pieces of plastic, depending on the size. And not only are they not floating in the water, but they're getting eaten by organisms, right? Right? Yeah. So you have these plastics that are inside fish, right? They're eating little plastic balls. They're absorbing microscopic, particles of plastic, and those will also negatively affect them, right? So we do this very, large amount of contamination to natural systems with, the technology that we have. And so, microplastics are technically anything less than 5 millimeters in size. And so, most of our microplastics come from, synthetic textiles. And so what it means by that is actually fishing nets. The largest amount of like plastics and stuff in the oceans are generally broken fishing nets, things like that are just discarded into the ocean. But even things such as car tires and even like city dust, like plastics coming off of buildings and things of that nature, make up a large portion of, parts of our ocean. And so, most of these plastics, they're up to like 280 million tons of plastic that are pumped into our oceans. Most of them can live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so they degrade in certain ways, right? So it's like not all of them are just floating as like a milk jug. But when they degrade, they'll degrade into smaller pieces, right? And so those microplastics are now incorporated into the food chain. And so they eat them, they block the digestive systems, they build up in organisms. Again, so this is kind of like our modern day worry and equivalent of, biomagnification, right? This is like our issue that we have to deal with in terms of making sure that these plastics don't build up. But there's only so much we can do with everything that's already in the water, right? How are we going to sift through and remove all of the less than 5 millimeters in size plastic? It's very difficult. We're more likely going to have to do something in terms of making plastics that are more sustainable. All right, let's see.
Did you know, guy?
All right, so there's a little video on macroplastics.
You could say.
It was completely legal to dump plastic in the ocean until the 90s, and a lot of that plastic is still there because plastic lasts out there for a very long time. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. We know that over 300 species of wildlife have ingested this material. It's been reported in animals. And so as it is eaten by animals, it actually can move up the food web. And as the scientific literature on this issue increases, literally almost every habitat they've gone to, seamounts, Arctic ice, coral reefs, deep sea, it's become ubiquitous. And I don't think anybody would fight anyone on an argument that plastic debris has not become a contaminant of concern.
Collecting the samples by using a manta trawl. It's basically a big metal box with wings. It looks like a manta ray with a very long, about 12-foot mesh net off the back.
1, 2, 3, splash!
And at the end is a piece we can take off that has collected all of the solids. You rinse it all out, filter it through another strainer, and then put it into a jar. It's caught a lot of other stuff. If you want to take a look at what we're rinsing out of the screen, it's more tiny plastic.
What we're concerned about ultimately is what are the implications of trash going into the water, getting into the food we harvest? And we're still connecting the dots there a bit. We know that lots of trash goes out into the water. We know that the sun and waves breaks it down into small pieces. We know that many species of animals eat it. And we also know that bigger animals eat smaller animals. And we also know that we eat those big trophy fish. And so what we're really trying to figure out is how big a vector plastic is for transporting chemicals into the tissues of the animals that we eat every day. That's a big problem, much bigger than big chunks floating out into the ocean.
We don't know exactly what that plastic is. We don't know where exactly it's coming from. And if we're trying to find policy and educational solutions to it, we need to know what we're targeting. We can't just ban plastic. That's not going to work. What kind of plastic is it, and what's the best policy route to reduce it? Is it a ban? Is it a fee? Is it market change? Is it education and behavior change work? What's the best way to tackle it? And until we know exactly what we're dealing with, we're not going to be able to design the right programs to address it.
All right. So yeah, right. So we have these buildup. Again, we don't even know how many of these plastics are making it into our environment, into things that we eat. things of that nature. So, we should really be concerned about these microplastics, and the ability to, make more sustainable ways of housing our soda and things of that nature. And so that's affecting our environments. One thing they've noticed is corals actually get sicker when there are more microplastics in the water. So there's even things down to, a metabolic, symbiosis kind of species relation that plastics are messing with, right? These plastics are unnatural chemicals that are in an environment that are messing with these functions. And so, right, they can have unforeseen consequences. And then another thing that you may not think about is the fact that, these plastics are coming from a diversity of places, right? And then they're floating through the ocean, they're moving around. And so they actually contain a lot of pathogens and allows them to contaminate new places and new areas by, the dumping of these plastics and the traveling of these plastics. They're not necessarily biodegradable, but there are organisms that will live on them, around them, and bacteria and stuff. Protists will always find a way, right, in order to live in their environments. The other thing I want to quickly talk about is the idea of climate change. And it's not just increasing temperatures, right? Temperature increases aren't consistent. There's actually, talking about laws of physics and thermodynamics, the difference in temperature between the mixing of two things actually affects how great of a change there is. So for instance, if you have something that's at 50 versus 50 and 100, the change in temperature is going to be much less dramatic than if it's 0 and 100. So not only do we have certain places increasing, such as the coldest places, right, at the the top, the poles of our planet, but we also have certain areas that are sorry. Someone walked into the room, scared me. Sorry. Yes, so we have, these different air currents that are mixing, right? Our planet is just not a dynamic, our planet is dynamic, right? It's not just a single isolated set of, waves or air, right? And so for instance, places like, the Midwest, our region of America and Canada are actually getting overall colder, right? And it's changing our weather patterns, right? And so cold areas have the greatest increase. But when you have air currents that are flowing around, such as you say, this cold current that's coming in from Canada and Alaska, it's going to come into contact with these other increased temperature fronts, right? And so the more intense temperature differences between the cold areas and the hot areas lead to more intense storms, which is why we've been having increases in, rainfall, snowfall, all of those things, right? You have hot and cold coming together, you're creating condensation. Condensation is building up in that water cycle, and then you wind up having rain and or snow. And so, I'm sure you've all heard about climate change and greenhouse gases plenty. But I just wanted you to be aware that, it's dynamic. It's not just getting warmer. It's places are warmer and colder, and the mixture is causing great changes in those different types of environments, right? If you're completely changing the weather pattern, you're having worse storms, you're going to create issues for biodiversity, right? You're only going to have those creatures that are able to properly deal with those disturbances. And then also, part of this is happening because of this buildup of greenhouse gases, right? And so as greenhouse gases build up in our atmosphere, they trap more heat and sunlight. And so you're actually going to be changing the amount of, photosynthesis and things in a region. And so this is causing a lot of difficulty in terms of, changes in environments. And so, warmer, and part of that is, not only are we increasing the temperature of the air, things like that, but we're also warming seawater. And so if you remember anything, about talking about like gills and breathing, there's not a lot of oxygen in water to begin with. So when you increase the temperature of the water, you actually are making it harder to hold on to oxygen, which makes it ultimately harder for fish to breathe. And so fish have started to migrate further to reach the same type of temperatures. And so now you have aquatic systems where organisms that didn't migrate are migrating. And so they're coming into contact with new organisms, and they're shifting all of these relationships and these food webs, right? An organism that didn't migrate that is now migrating might become an invasive species in another area. And then with that, predators need to follow the distribution of their prey. And so, we have changes in biomes due to, the incorporation of sharks into northern regions that they've never been before, because now there are fish there, and now they have enough, it's warm enough that they can breathe, or it's that they're going to seas where they can actually breathe. And so you have changes in what plants can survive. But then also, not only, if you remember when we're talking about pressure, gas pressure and things of that nature, if we are building up more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to increase partial pressure, and it's actually going to force more of that carbon dioxide into the water. And so you're actually going to have increasing in carbon dioxide in the water, which ultimately makes it more acidic. And so you have a decline in pH. And so, that acidity is going to affect organisms that are breathing it in, organisms that need, a particular pH to maintain homeostasis. And so not only is the temperature of the ocean rising, but it's becoming more acidic, which ultimately, melts and changes sea levels. You have loss of habitats. Increasing the CO2, for instance, in water leads to changes in metabolic and respiratory rates in, organisms such as sharks and things of that nature. It appears, obviously there could be organisms that do better in this setup, but since these environments have been so similar, been the same for so long, a lot of these organisms are not as adaptable. For instance, the coral reefs, the temperature change for coral reefs that negatively affects them is only about 2 degrees, which may not seem like a lot, but within a water environment, an aquatic environment, that's a lot. And so, these acidifications could affect the ability for sharks to find food. And then obviously, if this acidity is killing, and changing these like plankton or these different protists, you're going to be greatly changing that environment, right? And so that's another issue that we have to worry about, not only about climate change in general, but, acidification of the oceans. And, naturally, some of this stuff kind of occurs, right? There's fluctuations in CO2 in the environment over time in general. But, we're leading to a much more, we're leading to an increase in temperature and CO2 and acidification at a much faster rate than is generally seen in nature. And that makes it more difficult for organisms to adapt, right? So let's go with. Oh no. Oh, they removed that video since I last. Oh, that's unfortunate. Well, that video was a migration of sharks talking about them moving into new habitats. That's unfortunate. But last thing I want to talk about real quickly is just give you a little information on corals and kind of how these temperature changes are affecting them. So one thing that's really cool about corals is that they have a symbiotic relationship with algae. And so, those protists, those small organisms are going to be undergoing photosynthesis and producing their own energy. And so what corals actually do is in their endothermus, they actually have a particular region of cells that absorb different types of algae. And so often these corals have symbiotic relationships with more than one type of algae at a time. But what happens is, that algae is producing energy through photosynthesis and creating sugars. And then the coral allows them to live in them, giving them some type of protection. And then trading that essentially for energy. And so one thing we've discovered is that unfortunately, most of the coral's energy is actually obtained through this photosynthetic symbiosis. It's obviously not all of them. Certain species are more or less adaptable to changes in this. But the problem is that as temperatures increase, these coral are not able to properly maintain their symbiotic relationship. And what happens is that at higher temperatures, the algae are changing their metabolic processes. So no longer at high temperatures are they able to, undergo photosynthesis in such a a good enough way. Instead, they start undergoing different types of respiratory procedures, and that actually starts creating toxins within the coral's body. And so in order to survive, the coral has to eject those algae or it's going to get poisoned, right? It doesn't have any way to deal with those toxins because the coral, naturally, those algae are not producing them. It's only because of the change in acidity and temperature that they're starting to produce poisons. And so in response, only 2 degrees of change will cause this stressing out of the algae. And so the coral will then eject their algae, and then they will lose the ability to photosynthesize. And that was also why they'll lose their color, which is why it's called being bleached, right? They lose their color and they become vulnerable. And so after that happens, it is possible certain species can bounce back if the temperature is lower, and they can reabsorb algae. But a lot of what we're finding is these coral reefs aren't restorable. Once that synthetic relationship is broken, symbiotic relationship is broken, the coral winds up trying to survive for as long as it can, and slowly it will die due to not being able to feed itself. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a video of like what coral bleaching looks like. It is sped up, it is a it is a time lapse, but you'll be able to see. Okay, cool. So this organism is being stressed. You can see this coral is like a green color and some white, so it's already starting to be stressed. But you can see it's going to start squeezing, and all of that powder that's coming out, that mist, is the algae being ejected out of the coral. And you can see as it does that, it gets lighter and lighter and whiter, right? And so this happens in real time, right? This is sped up a little bit, but again, you can see it's slowly getting sick, right? It's slowly having to expel this algae because it senses what's happening, and then it's not going to be able to produce, it's not going to be able to produce enough energy to sustain all of its cells, right? This is a very delicate system. And then without the corals, we start losing entire habitats, right? Corals are not just organisms in an environment, right? They act as substrates. They act as the buildup of as they die, they build up and create coral reefs, which allow for organisms to continue to live and survive, right? They create their own micro environment. All right, so that's all I have for y'all today. Here are the concept questions. So there will be, there should be a study guide up for quiz 6. I will put up a study guide sometime in the next few days for your final. Just kind of picking out what the key concepts are I would like you to know for it. Once again, the structure of the final is there are 4 pages. The first 3 pages, there's one of information for each of the units. There's like a fill in the blank thing that are much more specific than the past ones, trying to lead you along those. And then there's a few multiple choice for each unit. Then at the end, there are 2 essay questions like usual. You have 2 hours, once again, to do it. You have 2 hours in order to take it, and 24 hours to start it. So yeah, any questions about anything? And you're welcome.
I have a question about quiz 5, the one we just took.
Yep.
Can we go over question 18? My comment was, how are their niches different? And I kind of thought I explained it, but obviously I didn't. So I was wondering if we could go over that.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to copy and paste the question?
No, I have it. I'm going to your exam.
Okay.
Right, 18. Well, so this is something that a lot of people did, just terms of not being very specific. So yeah, you say that there's like differences in resource allocation to coexist, but how do they allocate those resources differently, right? Like what are changing about the behavior of the organisms, or how they're feeding, or what they're doing. I was just looking for a little bit more specific detail on that, because you are right, they are resource partitioning, but there are very different ways of organisms doing that. And so I was just looking for something more specific in terms of that, and how they limit competition in that way.
So, like what kind of things could I have wrote to make it more specific? Because I knew when I was doing this, I was like, I'll just write this down, but I'm not sure if this is like everything I need.
Yeah, so organisms who have very similar niches will change where they exist in an environment, right? They'll change the timing of when they go to get food, or where they like to hunt, in terms of the spatial organization of a community, right? They try not to overlap in terms of prey, or organisms will often be diurnal versus nocturnal, right? More the fact that there are severe changes, even though organisms look the same, there are severe changes in where they like to limit their microenvironment, and where and their hunting, foraging strategies and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions, Mia?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the final. I'm like a little bit confused on how it's gonna be administered. Is it just gonna be like the quizzes, like we have 24 hours
Yeah.
to do it? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like the quizzes on it's literally the exact same thing. You'll log on, you have 24 hours to open it and take it. It's just you just have a little bit more time to do it.
Okay. Sounds good. I have a question about the quiz for question number 14.
Sure.
I was just really confused. I don't understand it. Like, yeah, could you explain? I don't really understand how either like coconuts floating in the ocean is clumped, or penguins huddling for warmth are clumped. Like, I understand the walnut trees one and the dandelion, but A and B, I don't really understand.
Okay. Sorry, which number was that? I'm just trying to find
14.
it. 14. All right. Yeah. So so the idea was to ask which is not correctly matched.
Mhm.
So you're right. So walnut trees are producing chemicals which are killing everything around them, and so they have empty spaces, so they're uniformly distributed in a community,
Yeah.
right? Dandelions randomly distributed, they float, if they survive, they survive. And so penguins are living in communities, right? And so when they huddle for warmth, they're going to be clumping constantly in order to keep themselves alive. And so that's going to be, their population spread, right? They're, you know, so there's that. The question is really getting at the fact that coconuts, you know, floating is not clumped, right? They're actually more randomly distributed, right? If a coconut's floating in the ocean, it's more likely to be similar to a dandelion seed, right? Where it's being blown around, the ocean currents are going to move it. So it's a lot more random, right? It doesn't have, it doesn't actively, it's not actively able to clump, right? Or like, you're not going to see a lot of coconuts floating in the ocean clumping together, right?
For some reason, when I read that, that's what I pictured, was just like clumps of coconuts, like moving from island to island. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. but penguins huddled, I'm still confused about that one because like, isn't that just a behavior? Like, I don't know, like if I got into a group of my friends and we were hanging out, like I couldn't say we're now a clumped population, could I? I don't know.
Well, so I guess there's kind of, if you think about it, you know, penguins in their communities will have their little spaces, right? So they will be a little like uniformly distributed, but as a community, right, they're all living in the same exact area, right? They're living in a very close, small area. So you kind of think of it that way, but you're right. It is a behavioral thing, right? A lot of organisms that live in clumped environments are doing it behaviorally, right? Like, you know, elephants are actively living in communities. Bees are actively living in communities, right? They're choosing to have that behavior to be clumped. It is a little bit weird. I guess it is a little confusing because like coconuts are like the one that has like the least agency in this, like the least choice of what's happening to it. But yeah, so.
Yeah, I think I understand now. That makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Alrighty.
All right.